thank you all for making the time to come and join us for this conversation this morning. You know the topic. It's a long-standing topic. Mim and I first met, I think, in the context of a Defense Science Board study 20 years ago on the CBW topic. And one of the main themes in that study was the ebb and flow over the prior 20 years of interest in the chem-bio topic. A spike of interest in the early 80s because of revelations about Soviet CBW capabilities, a slow ebb over the 1980s as other problems came to the fore, a spike of interest again in the early 1990s with news of Saddam's interest. And you can see this pattern repeating itself over the decades, looking back over the last 4 decades. And so part of the question Mim will address this morning is, where do we stand in that ebb and flow cycle? And is our level, and I think the shorthand is that our focus on this topic is again at a low point from a national and from a national security community perspective. But there's good reason to think that's the wrong way to approach this topic, and Mim will set out some of that thinking. And then the study also goes on to address what the Department of Defense is doing and ask whether it's doing the right things. And naturally enough, if the focus isn't on the problem, then what the department's doing is probably off the mark. And so Mim's presentation will address these points. You are all here because you know Dr. Miriam John. I shouldn't do a long introduction beyond her prior affiliation as Vice President for the California operation of Sandia. But that's when she retired is when she really went to work, apparently. There's a list of about 15 boards here. She is a member of the DoD's the Defense Science Board, and she's talking to a DSB study this morning. She's Vice Chair to Ron Lehman on the DoD Threat Reduction Advisory Committee. She served as the immediate past chair of the National Academy's Naval Studies Board, as a member of the Intelligence Community Advisory Board, and Board on Chemical Sciences and Technology. For her support to the Department of Defense, she recently received the Eugene Fubini Award, which is handed out rarely to people who have given significant contributions and a significant and sustained contribution in an advisory capacity to the department. But her work extends well beyond the Department of Defense. She's a member of the Board of Advisors for MIT Lincoln Labs, member of the board at Sandia, member of the board at Leidos, formerly SAIC. Only until Friday. So what 2 new assignments are you going to take on after Friday? That seems to be the pattern here. Please join me in welcoming Mim John.
Thank you, Al. I see so many familiar faces in the audience, and there are quite a few of you who could get up here and do a better job at this than I will. And you'll probably go to sleep because you'll say, again, and all. But as Brad said, this is plagued by being an episodic, if you will, activity in the government, not just in DoD, but in the government in general. And it's a concern. In fact, in one study, we were so upset that we just said, all right, let's just brainstorm everything that's happened over the last, it's WMD related, over the last, say, 20 years. And we ended up on a chart with 12-point font, which it's not the right size for a view graph, right? And all single-spaced, totally full, and ran out of room. And we just said, hey, it happens. And why is it that it's treated so episodically? I won't say that I'm imbued with optimism that things will change on this, but we have a strong supporter in Chris Hassel, who's the Deputy Assistant Secretary for the time being in this area, who's very sympathetic to the sort of reset on how to think about the problem, which is largely what this is all about. Okay, I want to spend a few minutes of introduction, though, to put the study in context. We were asked about 2 years ago, well, I was asked by the chairman of the Defense Science Board to recruit a partner, and I recruited Bill Schneider, couldn't think of anybody better, and all, to think about what we needed to do in the WMD space, okay? What was being ignored, what was important to take a look at, and the instructions were write a terms of reference that are exceptionally broad, and also that you've got license to roam wherever you need to. We certainly didn't address all of the terms of reference, but we did come up with one, rationalizing why it was important to take yet another look at this topic. The DSB had maintained a pretty steady drumbeat on nuclear issues, but we too had been episodic about chem and bio. In the context of broader WMD, though, as motivation for the study, I don't think I'm revealing anything new to you all by talking about, you know, how the threat had changed over the last decade or so, with both the vertical proliferation concerns in Russia and China, the horizontal concerns as represented by North Korea in particular, and at least for the time being, the stemming we've done on that with Iran, but also the pressures that's putting on our extended deterrence guarantees. And then up on the screen pops the Syria problem. What else do we call it? And oh, by the way, technology didn't stand still in all of this. And you all know, a lot of you who work in the classified area, the impact that technology can potentially have, particularly in the nuclear area, but certainly the rapid pace at which the biological sciences are advancing. At the same time that all this is going on, and you know, I said for the longest time until maybe the last 2 years, when at least the nuclear problem is starting to get a bit more attention at the national level, I felt like the little dog yapping, you know, saying, hey, it's happening, you know, we got to pay attention to this. And people say, yeah, go back and come back later, right? We hadn't done much. And so that was really kind of spooky to a lot of us. All of a sudden, Russia is a surprise. Where have people been? All of a sudden, you know, China is surprising us at how fast they're able to field new capabilities. And then you had how slowly we acted with Syria, and not realizing the potential for this being a tipping point around things that had been sacrosanct for some time with respect to chemical and biological weapons and all. And of course, he surprised us initially with the use of toxic industrial chemicals. We weren't looking for that and all. Now, of course, we saw something considerably more serious. So in that context, we said, well, we can't, you know, we don't have the wherewithal to take on all of this and actually get out a report in anybody's lifetime. So what can we do over the next year and a half that might be useful? And we came up with three themes, one of which I had the opportunity just now to spend some time over in 140 with some of the Z Division folks and talk about, namely something that we had put forward in an earlier study on monitoring and verification for nuclear proliferation, but it hadn't caught on, and yet we thought it was very, very important. And Bruce can recall that we said, you know, an operating premise was the earlier you find it, the more options you have to deal with it. And yet, what we saw in the community was evolution, making what we'd always done better. Okay, and we said, look, the tools have changed. We can do much better than that. I'm not going to talk about that, but that was one of the themes, and there will be a volume of our set of reports that comes out dedicated to that. The second theme was around nuclear, and at the time we got started, Cross-domain deterrence was the hot topic, and as a concept, but we couldn't find a lot of there, okay, with respect to how far had DoD in particular gotten in integrating their planning and their practicing along these lines. And even by the end of the study, people had understood what it was going to take, but they were still sort of drawing a line between if they go nuclear, then we hand off to Stratcom. Whereas that gray zone of there are shades of nuclear, and what if you find yourself in that zone of very limited nuclear use, and we would prefer not to escalate, which means we'd have to fight through, and people were not spending a lot of time thinking about that problem. So we spent a little time in that volume of the report talking about threat, talking about the complications it introduces, and talking about the need for how to go about putting some substance behind the notion of cross-domain or integrated deterrence. And finally, what you all came here to learn about or listen to me yap about, namely the Chembio Defense area. As many of you know who've been associated with this, we've sort of played a little bit of kiddie soccer in our approach to it, with focusing on exquisite response, focusing in the DoD context on protecting the warfighter, focusing on contamination avoidance. Those have all been sort of strategic drivers at different points in time, and it drives then the technical development that goes on. So if you want contamination avoidance, you start looking at detectors, point detectors forward or standoff detection. If you want to protect the warfighter, you put a lot into medical vaccinations and countermeasures and that kind of thing, and buy new suits for everybody, which they did. And then, of course, in DHS, it was all about response, right? It was really about detect and start to figure out how to pull together the civil authorities to respond. The problem we found was that, hey, the threat's moving so fast that approaching it in any of these ways is going, in any narrow way like this is going to be fairly bankrupt. So that I'm going to tell you the answer many times over, that what's old is new again. Think defense in depth, and this will look familiar to some of the Sandia folks because it was some of the things that we built some of our early systems analytical work around in thinking about the problem. So let's move to the topic at hand. Things have changed, surprise. But if you start imagining what could happen today and into the future, it's pretty easy to frighten yourself a bit. Today, with the introduction of drones, you don't have to put people at risk in delivering, and you don't have to even worry about attribution. So that chemical attacks are both very real and possible on facilities and from DoD's perspective, concentrations of troops in ways that they hadn't thought about before. We've worried for some time about terrorist attacks on CONUS, but the fact that you've got a lot of naturally occurring diseases that have been around for a while and that are accessible, and our it wasn't totally dysfunctional, but our less than stellar performance in reacting to some of these events, as you would witness in the Ebola incident. A lot of turmoil within the department about who's on first and who's got capability to respond to this. Those are the kind of things that a terrorist could take great advantage of. And of course, if you think about where technology's going, as we mentioned earlier, it doesn't take a lot of imagination to start to figure out that there are things that we can't even anticipate. So the program has been historically built on a threat list, okay, of, quote, traditional agents that go back to World War I and II. And then there were countermeasures to each of those threats that were imagined or worked on at any one point in time, against a backdrop of what could happen with respect to a combination of the agents themselves and the delivery means that now is much more complicated. That is sort of a bankrupt strategy because putting a lot of resources into solving one problem, it's pretty easy to imagine that that the thinking adversary would go a different direction. So to borrow a word from Brad, victory in this context starts to need to look like the absence, how do we build capabilities to not prevent, but just not have an attack in the first place, as opposed to defending in one way or another against it. So that leads us to, not going to be used, deterrence. And to put it in context for people who don't think about, in this community, they don't think about deterrence per se. We said, okay, let's keep it simple. And we said, how do you translate the principles of deterrence into what it means for, chem and bio? And you can imagine each of these playing a role. It's, okay, it isn't available, or, you can't count on it, or it's too expensive. Now, a lot of those barriers are falling down, certainly in the bio area. But the next point is pretty important. It's uncertain to achieve the aim of the attacker, and we'll get into why we match that up with defense in depth in a minute. You may want to drive them to different avenues by closing off these, because there are simpler ways to do it, and so far that's what we've seen. Questionable about if you make it illegal, that doesn't seem to deter some actors and all. But the cultural or ethical aspects are interesting in that we really had been operating under an assumption that, almost the entire world was signed up to the same sort of cultural, ethical biases that we had against the use of chemical or biological weapons. And Assad has sort of put that, that assumption to rest and all. And one of our task force, well, not task force members, one of our advisors said, yeah, we keep talking about asymmetric warfare, but we have to overlay an ethical asymmetry these days that plays into this. The next one is important. It might backfire, okay, which is certainly a risk with biological. How are you going to control it, particularly if it's highly infectious? And then the whole attribution-retribution piece, which people have tended to dismiss as being too hard, but we see glimpses of technologies that might, if explored a little bit more, that might allow us to start tagging chemicals so we could get to the source, that might allow us to trace back to who produced the bioweapon in the first place. The complications for us, of course, is that in contrast to nuclear, we cannot threaten with response in kind. And we're an ideal target for a lot of these wide area weapons because we're an open society. Okay. If we're gonna explore whether deterrence might work in this context, and I'm not going to give you an answer today that says it will work, but it's certainly worth a try, because over a year and a half we couldn't come up with anything better, to tell you the truth. But it's going to require a pretty dramatic shift in the way the department thinks about things, because it's driven typically by countermeasures to a pretty well-defined threat. And we're talking about something that's much more uncertain now as to how that threat might play out. It's also, in the DoD context, and DoD was our principal customer here, tough because this is not a department at the forefront of chemical sciences or biological sciences and all. That's not to say there aren't some very good people there working on the problem, but it's such a small group, and it's so under-resourced they can't possibly stay up with what's going on in the world. And you got to answer some hard questions. The zero casualty mentality in this regime, in this area, is just not going to play well because it's an impossible goal. And so you've got to start thinking about how many false alarms are you willing to tolerate, how many casualties are you willing to risk, and are you willing to spend money like we do in the nuclear domain on something that might never be used? Because that's a piece of the solution. So with respect to creating some meat on this notion of deterrence as the driving principle, we said, okay, well, what can we say? We started, quite frankly, initially saying, let's do chem, let's do bio. They've been put together for too long, and we know they're different, and we know the responses are different, and so on. But as we worked through those, we found, well, there's a lot in common at a high level, okay? It's the implementation where you've got to pay attention to the nature of the agents themselves and the delivery means as far as creating a real capability. But the point is you can dial them up and down, right, to a certain extent. And your targets are generally people, not destruction of either warfighting equipment or in the civilian context, buildings and the like. Attribution is pretty difficult for both because of the ease with which you can mask these activities behind legitimate activities. And we're being surprised on the methods of attacks, particularly chem. People had largely dismissed chem as something of concern, that we had it in hand. And guess what? We're surprised, right? We're surprised in Syria at the use of ticks on civilian populations. We were woefully ill-prepared for the sarin attacks on our own troops, okay? And all by ISIL. Where did they get it? How did they get it? All of that kind of thing. Again, from a DoD perspective, the docs and medics are trained for trauma, okay? That's their big thing. They see you come in sick, they're going to assume the flu and not even think to look for whether there's been exposure to a biological agent, whether it was intentional. So we got to do something in the medical community as well. Having established sort of that high-level commonalities of sorts, the devil's in the details, and the details, as you all know who work in it, are pretty important. The technical approaches to dealing with each of these is quite different, and chem is going to be more evolutionary, bio is going to be revolutionary. So yet there is room for surprise in chem, probably in the deployment and clever use of attacks, versus bio, which is going to surprise us with agents as much as it will with the means of attack. Bio looks more, as it will present itself, will look more like a public health issue. Chem, as it presents itself, and of course there are exceptions on each, but chem in general, as it presents itself, will look more like a hazmat issue. So that we came to the conclusion that we might be able to build a top-level strategy that has the principal piece parts that are common across for both, but the details are going to be different, and we go into gory detail in the report, which I won't do that to you today, but we started with let's get at the details. Then as we built a strategy, we said, okay, what is the context within which they might be used? And this is one chart that we never completely settled on, but in general, we had general agreement that chem was much better suited in a military context, bio, much more in a counter-value context against civilians and those kind of things. Not new, but certainly a reminder to people who haven't thought about this problem in a very, very long time. And the potential for surprise is significant. Okay, so what do we do about it? Okay. Again, given that you step back from this and say, well, this is a pretty daunting problem. We faced these kind of problems before when we didn't know where things would go. And we said, well, let's think about how we have approached this in the past. And we migrated to this notion of defense in depth. And all because it had a lot of flexibility, okay, in and of itself. But it's going to require, as we said at the beginning, a very significant mind shift in how the program itself is approached and managed, and whether they're willing probably to make not just some changes in the way they think about the problem, but build into it some aspects that they've never had before, namely analytics, systems analysis, things that allow you to do trade-offs on where to invest, accepting that we can't achieve perfection with any one course of action, but if we're balanced in our approach to the problem, we may have a pretty robust set of activities. Okay, and that argument is made on the next chart. Why do we think this is a good way to do it? If you have a collection, instead of a collection of standalone programs, but you have made, you approach the problem with an understanding of the end-to-end possibilities. And one element, understanding, as you all know, if you've worked in this area, that what you can do, even though it's imperfect in one step, makes the job in the next step a whole lot easier. So they start to cooperate in direct or indirect ways. And equally important, it starts to introduce uncertainty with each step. Maybe not total, not totally, but if you start to pile on the steps, you can do the statistics, right? That, a 50% chance of success at step one, compounded by a 50% chance of success and so on down the line, gets you to the point that an thinking adversary will probably say, there's too much risk that this is going to succeed. The other thing that it does in this context is that it gives it a headline, okay? It gives it a headline like ballistic missile defense. It gives it a headline that it doesn't have right now because of the way the program is managed. To talk about a system as opposed to piece parts, which has plagued the program at least in the 20 plus years that many of us have been looking at it. Now the next chart is going to look awfully familiar to the Sandians and possibly to Brad from the 2005 summer study as to what were we talking about. There's Larry, he's smiling real big because he helped invent this. And remember those bar charts, Larry, where we said, okay, if you were in chem, bio, or nuclear, what would you emphasize versus others? It's adapted a little bit for the current world, in which we are introducing, on the one hand, the importance of the front end, and that feeds into another part of our study about how the intelligence function in this area could be greatly enhanced, something that had been dismissed in this area because it was just too hard, but it can be greatly enhanced with the new tools that are presented with big data and data analytics. The other thing is the importance of the tech base. That this has been, nobody has approached this area like they have the nuclear problem. But technology is getting to the point now where you really have to be concerned about the existential nature of the bio threat in particular, and in a campaign sense, what the chem threat can do to undermine maybe not our life, but certainly our way of living. So what happens next in the study is that we go into, this is a readable chart. We have many unreadable charts in the report that talk about at a general level how, what principles apply to each of those steps, or what sort of activities you would want to bring in. But then we go into the chem piece and talk more specifically about what it would take, into the bio piece and more specifically what it would take. And again, don't seek perfection, but just seek capability and understand what capabilities you have across all of these, and practice, practice, practice. Okay, but there's some other things that stand in the way. We talked about DoD's limited set of capabilities to address this, because technically they are not really on top of this game. And certainly we'll have to go outside to, much like has happened with information technology, cyber issues and the like. They need to grow more in-house capability, but they also need to have much stronger partnerships outside than they do now. And if you think that's bad, go to the intelligence community in this area. The people that are doing the analysis at NGIC, I have fingers left over after I raise this hand, and count them. And so it's a little wonder that we aren't seeing much, okay? You don't see much, so you don't put assets on the problem, right? Well, the problem is pretty hard, and you need more, not less assets, because it's so easy to hide. And if we're going to go along these lines, there are some serious policy issues that have to be looked at. That include, what do you replace the threat list with, the validated threat? What's happening to our conventions and treaties now? We still are adhering to the CWC and the BWC, but what does that mean? And it looked like to us, the DoD labs would never say it themselves, but a little bit of probing, that the legal interpretations are such that they are so restricted on being able to work with live agents because of the transgressions perceived around the treaties that, quite frankly, and since we lack a science program in surrogate agents, I don't think that I would tell a commander today that he should have confidence in the protective gear that he's assuming are going to get him through, and all. That's not a popular discussion, but it needs to be had, particularly if you're going to worry about a range of threat possibilities as opposed to the canonical threat list of, a couple of handfuls of agents. The other thing they don't do a very good job at is really forcing themselves in through a scenario. So we're in the process of trying to create a couple of scenarios and saying this is what you need to really think about to flesh out an approach like this, and understand where current capabilities support you and where you have gaping holes in capabilities. So we are creating one, and we're testing it a little bit among ourselves to see if it's realistic. You don't need to read this. The gist of it is kids are playing soccer in a Japanese U.S. Servicemen's family day. One kid gets sick a few days later, and then other kids present with Marburg, and then adults, and it spreads, and so on and so on. And there's this, oh, by the way, as you unpeel this, of a contact made by a North Korean colleague of someone in Africa, et cetera, that nobody knew about until long after the fact. Okay, so that's just a made-up example, I hope, and all. But it gives you, and by the way, there are some scenarios that the program plays to. There aren't scenarios of any substance like this in the defense planning scenarios in general, but the program at least has been wise to create some scenarios, but they're very limited. They're very limited about a fight-through situation. Something happens on the battlefield, and were you able to detect it? That's where it stops. So we said, okay, let's just think about end to end. Here's just a sampling of the kind of questions you need to answer, and everybody needs to be at the table to answer these questions. So in trying to construct a couple of these to try to lead them along, because again, like I say, it's not a community that's used to working in this way. We were trying to say, we have proposed, and we will admit that we think it's a great idea, but it needs to be tested. We have proposed a new strategy for how the program should be organized and run, but let's test it. And so hopefully they will move forward with things like that, but we'll see. I will say that Dasty Hassel and Tom Hopkins, who are the principal OSD keepers of this program, are pretty sympathetic to this approach because they know that they've not made much progress. But there is a highly calcified set of organizations in the department that are almost on autopilot in running the program the way they've always run it, right? That's not to say they have an advanced capability, but it's been point solutions along the way. Okay, so the recommendations actually are a lot, are discussed in a lot more depth in the report, but they sort of follow in obvious ways from what we've talked about, namely recasting the program in a more comprehensive end-to-end strategy and build the base against which you can start to make trade-offs. And it would not be a DSB report unless we said you had to have red teaming as a part of all of this. But probably step one is reacquainting the leadership, whether it had been the old leadership in the department or the incoming leadership now. This is not something that they are concerned about outside of what do we do with Syria, and make sure that doesn't spread. But thinking about it this way, no, and even the cruise missile attack, well, yeah, so what? What's next, okay? Where does that fit in sort of any kind of comprehensive approach to shutting that problem down? Okay, we all know that DOD is not had a lot of success in fielding medical countermeasures. In fact, in the 20 years that I've been paying attention to the program, I don't think we've gotten but one out. and it's, they're trying to do it on a shoestring, and they're trying to run it through the normal FDA processes. So they seriously need to rethink how they're going to approach this, particularly when we're talking about, as we said earlier, things that may never be used, okay? So just like the National Vaccine Program that HHS put in place right after the anthrax attacks, right after 9/11, that's sort of in place, but now people are questioning about sustaining it because, again, the stuff isn't used and it has a shelf life. What is the right strategy for DOD? And we've tried to encourage them in directions of things like off-label exploration, so that things that were already approved and in use for other reasons could be rapidly grabbed as a stopgap until something more particular to the threat at hand could be put in place. There are new rapid manufacturing techniques that they're starting to explore in DOD. Bless their hearts, they are actually doing that. And in talking to the FDA, it's amazing how flexible those folks in the FDA that try to work with DOD are, and DOD is not. So, we got a little bit of a mismatch there. The other thing that was, sort of an expedient right now is to make sure that the medical community in DOD at least starts to understand they might need to look at something different than trauma and be able to at least raise that specter. And oh, by the way, they have a tremendous opportunity for training if there is an outbreak in the U.S. as adjuncts to the civilian responders, and to get some insight into what it means to deal with large numbers of people who might be affected. And finally, it's all about the people, okay? And in the end, there are lots of things that are wrong with the way the program's run. This is a buy by the drink program for the technical community, as the labs here know, but even their own internal labs are plagued by this. And if you think DOE is bad with reporting, you have a rival in what the program currently requires of USAMRIID, ECBC, and ICD on their reporting on $50,000 and $100,000 science projects and the like. So anyway, I raced through that, and it may have been short on the detail you want. We have some backups if we need to go there, but I'd really rather have the conversation with you all now, because each time that we talk about this, or I talk about it, I learn a lot more with respect to things we didn't think about or better ways to give the message. So thank you for your attention.